February 15, 1944. 9:47 a.m. Caveang Harbor, New Guinea. A B-25. Mitchell explodes mid-air. The fireball swallows the cockpit in less than 2 seconds. Burning fuel rains down onto the ocean below. 3 men are already dead before they hit the water. 2 more are falling. No parachutes. Just bodies spinning through black smoke disappearing into waves that rise 16 feet high. On the beach, Japanese shore batteries are still firing. They are not finished. 6 miles away, a slow, ugly, ungainly flying boat is circling at 2,000 feet. The pilot watching all of this through his windscreen is not a war hero. He is not a fighter ace. He is a 27-year-old lawyer from a small town in Arkansas with a population of 3,200 people. He has never landed under fire. He has never attempted a rescue in seas this violent. Every protocol in the United States Navy manual is about to tell him to turn around and go home. He is about to ignore every single one of them. Before this day is over, Nathan Gordon will land 4 times in an active combat zone under direct artillery fire, with a disintegrating aircraft in waves that should have killed him on the first attempt. He will pull 20 men out of that harbor. He will do it with no fighter cover. A flooding hull, 1 working engine, and the absolute refusal to accept that mathematics could tell him what was possible. This is the story of the most insane rescue mission in the history of naval aviation. And it started with a man nobody expected to save anyone. Nathan Gordon grew up in Morrilton, Arkansas, which is the kind of town where everybody knows your name, your father's name, and what you had for breakfast. His father ran a small law practice. His mother taught piano. There was nothing about Nathan Gordon's early life that screamed military legend. He attended Columbia Military Academy in Tennessee, graduated as salutatorian in 1933, then went to Arkansas Polytechnic College, and finally earned his law degree from the University of Arkansas in 1939. He opened his own practice back in Morrilton. Wills, property disputes, minor criminal defense, the kind of work that fills decades quietly and ends with a retirement dinner and a small plaque on the wall. He also joined the Arkansas National Guard because that seemed like the responsible thing to do for a young man who believed in preparation. Part-time soldier, full-time lawyer. That was his entire plan for the next 40 years. Then December 7, 1941 arrived. Gordon was sitting in a movie theater in Morrilton when the announcement came over the loudspeaker. Japanese forces had attacked Pearl Harbor. All military personnel report immediately. He walked out of that theater without watching the end of the film, drove to the National Guard Armory, and reported for duty. He had already enrolled in Navy flight training before Pearl Harbor, a decision made months earlier that suddenly meant something completely different. He was sent to Jacksonville, Florida for primary instruction. His instructors noted 2 things about Gordon immediately. He had an unusual calm under pressure, and he made decisions fast. He graduated requested multi-engine aircraft and was assigned to PBY Catalinas. The PBY Catalina is not a glamorous aircraft. It never was. Pilots who flew Spitfires and Mustangs looked at the Catalina the way race car drivers look at a school bus. 104-foot wingspan. Maximum takeoff weight of 35,000 pounds. Top speed of 196 miles per hour, which sounds reasonable until you realize that was the absolute maximum in perfect conditions with no wind diving slightly. Cruise speed was 125 miles per hour. The Japanese Zero could fly at 331. In a straight race, the Catalina was not a race. It was a funeral. They called it Dumbo, after the Disney elephant, because it was enormous and somehow managed to fly anyway. Most pilots saw the PBY as a temporary assignment, a stepping stone toward something faster, something that could actually fight back. Gordon saw something different. He saw an aircraft that could land on water. Anywhere there was water. That meant anywhere men were drowning, anywhere a crew had gone down in the ocean, Gordon could put his aircraft down and bring them home. He requested assignment to VP-34, the Black Cat Squadron based at Samurai Advanced Seaplane Base in Milne Bay, New Guinea. The Black Cats flew at night. They painted their PBYs matte black, dropped down to wave-top height, attacked Japanese shipping in the dark. The Japanese called them nightmare birds. But VP-34 also flew Dumbo missions, search and rescue, the role Gordon had wanted from the beginning. By October 1942, he was flying combat operations. By February 1944, he had completed 47 missions, 3 rescues, 6 men saved, all from calm water far from enemy positions. Nothing had prepared him for Caveang. Caveang Harbor in February 1944 was the most heavily defended Japanese base in the Bismarck Sea. Months of Allied bombing had damaged it significantly, but had not destroyed it. Shore batteries remained operational. Anti-aircraft guns covered every approach. Japanese patrol boats worked the harbor perimeter. The 5th Air Force hit it regularly because it had to be hit, and every time they hit it, aircraft went down. On February 15th, the 5th Air Force sent 70 bombers. A-20 Havocs and B-25 Mitchells attacking at mast height, the suicidally low-level bombing tactic that produced either spectacular damage or catastrophic losses, and often both simultaneously. Gordon's assignment that morning was Dumbo duty, standby search and rescue during the raid. Standard procedure. The expectation was that he would circle at safe distance, monitor the radio, and return to base without incident. Most Dumbo missions ended exactly that way. Hours of boring patrol followed by a quiet flight home. At 9:52 a.m., his radioman, aviation radioman, 2nd Class Robert Strickler, handed him a message. A-20 down in the harbor. Crew location unknown. P-47 escorts requesting immediate assistance. Gordon checked his fuel. 1,800 gallons. 8 hours at patrol speed. He looked at his co-pilot, Ensign John Barfield, 23 years old, from Texas, on his 9th mission. Barfield's hands were already moving toward the throttles before Gordon said a word. The Navy's Dumbo protocols were not arbitrary rules invented by bureaucrats sitting safely behind desks. They existed because experience had proven that a rescue aircraft lost to enemy fire saved no one. You do not enter defended harbors without fighter escort. You do not land in heavy seas. You do not take on more survivors than the aircraft can carry. Every single protocol had been written in the blood of men who had ignored it. Gordon understood all of this. He pushed the throttles forward anyway. Arkansas Traveler Bureau number 08139 climbed to 2,000 feet and turned northeast toward Caveang Harbor. The engines were 2 Pratt & Whitney R-1830-92 twin Wasps, producing 1,200 horsepower each. Gordon pushed them toward their limits and did not look back. He reached the harbor at 10:08 a.m. and saw the battle from 10 miles out. Smoke columns from burning ships. Anti-aircraft fire bursting black across the sky. B-25 Mitchells strafing Japanese positions along the shore, and in the water, small yellow shapes, life rafts, men swimming. 4 P-47. Thunderbolts from the 348th Fighter Group were circling overhead, powerless. They could strafe. They could suppress. They could not land on water. They could only watch men drown. Gordon's radio man made contact with the P-47 lead. The fighter pilot's voice came back tight, controlled the voice of a man watching something terrible and not being able to stop it. He told Gordon what he was looking at least 3 crews down. 2 B-25s, 1 A-20. Men spread across half a mile of harbor. Shore batteries fully active and ranging on anything that moved. Then he said, what no fighter pilot says lightly, you attempt this, you are not coming out. Gordon acknowledged the message. Then he descended toward the harbor. At 1,500 feet, he assessed the water. Swells running 16 to 18 feet. The kind of seas that made experienced PBY pilots shake their heads and calculate hull stress tolerances. The kind of seas that made the flight manual use words like avoid and prohibit. A heavy landing in these conditions could shatter the hull on impact. A takeoff run might be impossible. The PBY needed relatively calm water to build the speed required to break free of surface tension. In heavy swells, the hull would pound through wave after wave, each impact a structural event, each impact potentially the final one. Gordon circled once, looking for the A-20 crew. He saw only debris, oil spreading across the surface, floating wreckage, no life raft, no arms waving. The A-20 crew was already gone. But 1 mile to the east, a yellow life raft. 5 men. B-25 crew. 800 yards from shore. Close enough that the Japanese gun emplacements were clearly visible on the beach from the air. Close enough that Gordon could see muzzle flashes. He lined up his approach. At 200 feet, he pulled power to idle. The Catalina descended toward the swells. The timing had to be exact. Hit a wave wrong, and the hull would shatter. Come in too fast, and the aircraft would cartwheel across the surface. Come in too slow, and it would stall and drop like a thrown stone. Gordon felt every vibration through the control yoke, every wind gust, every subtle shift in the aircraft's attitude. He had landed PBYs in rough water before, never this rough, never with shore batteries tracking his approach. At 10:23 a.m., Arkansas Traveler touched down. The impact hit 7 Gs. Gordon felt his teeth slam together. Strickler was thrown against his radio console. The aircraft bounced, came down again on the next swell. Another impact water spraying across the windscreen, the hull groaning under loads it was never designed to survive. Rivets popped, seams burst. Water began flooding into the bilge, but they were down, and they were floating. Gordon kept the engines running at low power and turned toward the life raft. 400 yards. The B-25 crew saw them and started paddling. The men moved slowly the way exhausted people move when their bodies are beginning to shut down. 20 minutes in water, that temperature was long enough to begin the process that ends in unconsciousness, and then death. The Japanese shore batteries opened fire. 4 37mm guns. The first shells kicked up waterspouts 50 yards short. Then 30. The gunners had found their baseline. They were ranging now, walking rounds toward the target in the systematic professional way that trained artillery crews operate. The next salvo would connect. Gordon did not have time to be careful. He is still in that harbor, still moving toward those 5 men, still refusing to turn around, and the worst of it has not even started yet. Because those 5 men in that yellow life raft are only the beginning. By the time this day is over, Gordon will have gone back into that harbor 3 more times, with an aircraft that is less aircraft than wreckage, with engines attached against defenses that have had hours to range on his exact position, with no fighter cover and no reasonable expectation of survival. 20 men are going to live because Nathan Gordon from Morrilton, Arkansas, decided that mathematics was not the final authority on what human beings could accomplish. In part 2, we go back into that harbor. We watch the hull crack. We watch the engine flood. We watch Gordon make the decision that every rational person around him told him was certain death. And we find out whether certainty was right. At 10:23 a.m. on February 15, 1944, Nathan Gordon had already done the impossible once. He had landed a PBY Catalina in 16-foot swells inside an active combat harbor under direct artillery fire. He had pulled 5 men from a life raft while Japanese 37mm guns walked shells toward him with professional precision. He had gotten airborne again when physics said he should not have been able to. 5 men were alive on his aircraft floor, bleeding, broken breathing. The hull was cracked. The bilge was flooding. The right wing had shrapnel holes in the fabric covering. Every sane calculation said the mission was complete. Then Strickler handed him the second message. 2 more B-25 crews down. Different location. 1 mile northwest. 4 men in one raft, 5 in another. Both rafts drifting toward shore. Japanese patrol boats moving to intercept. Gordon looked at the message for 3 seconds. He looked at his fuel gauge. 1,400 gallons. He looked at the water streaming across the cockpit floor. He looked at Barfield. Barfield's face had the color of old paper. This was his 9th mission, and he had just survived something that should have ended his 9th mission permanently. His hands were shaking slightly on the controls, not from fear exactly, from the physiological aftermath of terror, the body processing what had just happened and trying to decide how to classify it. He looked back at Gordon and nodded once. No words, just the nod. Gordon turned northeast back toward Caveang. The second approach was different, because Gordon now knew exactly what the harbor could do to his aircraft. The first landing had been an act of calculated courage against unknown variables. The second was an act of calculated courage with full knowledge of the damage each wave impact would inflict. He had felt the 7G impact. He had heard the hull groan. He had watched the bilge water rise. He was choosing to do it again with an aircraft that was already structurally compromised in identical sea conditions against defenses that had now had 20 additional minutes to prepare for his return. He spotted the first raft at 10:47 a.m. 4 men. B-25 crew. 600 yards from shore, closer than the first group had been. The Japanese patrol boats were 800 yards out, and closing at speed. Small, fast vessels armed with machine guns, crewed by men who understood exactly what they were doing and why. If those boats reached the survivors first, 4 American airmen would spend the remainder of the war in a prison camp. If they survived the trip to the camp, Japanese treatment of captured Allied airmen in the Pacific Theater was not governed by any convention Gordon had reason to trust. He lined up his approach. The 2 remaining P-47s were down to 20 minutes of patrol time. Their lead pilot came on the radio and said exactly that. Flat and informational, no apology in his voice, because there was nothing to apologize for. They could not manufacture fuel out of altitude. They were going to have to leave. Gordon acknowledged and descended anyway. He came in faster this time. He had learned from the first landing that hesitation in the final approach cost more than it saved. The impact was 8 Gs. Something in the hull structure cracked with a sound that Martin in the bilge later described as the noise a tree makes when it breaks rather than bends. A longitudinal stringer, a critical structural member running the length of the hull, had fractured. They were taking on water 3 times faster than before. Martin reported this over the intercom in the calm, precise tone of a man who has decided that panic costs more energy than it produces. The hull was failing. They had minutes. Gordon did not stop moving toward the life raft. The patrol boat saw them. Both vessels turned toward the PBY engines, pushing to maximum speed, 600 yards out and closing. The 2 P-47s dove. They strafed one boat, and it exploded in a column of white water and black smoke. They hit the second boat along the waterline, and it turned away, trailing fire. The fighters had bought Gordon approximately 2 minutes. Davis pulled all 4 survivors aboard. One was unconscious. The others moved like men whose bodies were operating on reserves they did not know they had. 9 survivors now on an aircraft designed to carry 8 people total, including crew. Gordon pushed the throttles forward. The engines responded. The aircraft did not move. The damaged hull had settled deeper into the water. The increased weight from survivors and flooding had pushed the Catalina past the threshold where its engines could overcome surface tension and hydrodynamic drag simultaneously. They were stuck. The patrol boats were regrouping. The shore batteries were ranging again. Gordon cut power completely, waited for a large swell to lift the nose, and when it came, he hit full throttle in the same instant. The Catalina lurched. The hull broke free. They were moving. The takeoff run destroyed what was left of the hull's structural integrity in increments. Each wave impact was a separate trauma. Each impact sheared more rivets, opened more seams, let in more water. Martin was screaming over the intercom that the bilge pump had failed. At 70 miles per hour, Gordon hauled back on the yoke too early, too slow, and the PBY mushed into the air, stalled and dropped back onto the surface. The impact shattered the right sponson. The wing float collapsed. The right wing dipped toward the water, and if it had touched the water at speed, they would have cartwheeled and died. Gordon applied full left aileron. He held the wing up by force of hand. He hit the throttles again, and the engines ran past their safe operating limits, and he did not care about their safe operating limits. At 80 miles per hour, he pulled again, and this time the Catalina stayed in the air. 50 feet. 100. Climbing at 100 feet per minute slower than a loaded freight elevator, but climbing. The P-47 lead came on the radio. Winchester, out of ammunition, headed home. You are on your own, Dumbo. The fighters peeled away. Strickler handed him a third message before the sound of the fighter engines had faded. Another B-25 down. 5-man crew. Life raft 600 yards from shore. Different beach, same harbor. Japanese defenses fully alerted now. Every gun position in Caveang had Gordon's approach angles, his landing zones, his speeds. They had been watching him for 40 minutes. They knew exactly where he would come from and exactly where he would go. The element of surprise that had never really existed was now completely gone. Gordon did not hesitate. He turned back toward the harbor. His crew said nothing. Not because they had nothing to say, because they had already had the conversation inside their own heads and reached the same conclusion Gordon had reached. They were either going to save every man in that harbor, or they were going to die in the attempt. Probably both. The math had stopped mattering somewhere between the first landing and the second. The third landing was the one that should have killed all of them. Gordon came in at 11:14 a.m., and the impact did not feel like an impact. It felt like the aircraft had been dropped from a significant height onto concrete. The already fractured hull structure collapsed in sections. Water entered the bilge not as a flow, but as a surge. Martin was suddenly standing in water to his thighs, and then his chest, in the span of seconds, still at his pump pumping water that was being replaced faster than physics allowed him to remove it. They had 3 minutes before the aircraft went under. Maybe less. Shore batteries opened fire immediately. They had Gordon's position from the previous 2 landings. The first salvo landed 10 feet from the left wing. The shrapnel came through the hull in multiple places, new holes adding to the inventory of damage that had been accumulating since 10:23 a.m. One piece of shrapnel the size of a man's thumb passed through the cockpit between Gordon and Barfield and embedded in the instrument panel. Neither of them looked at it. Davis pulled 5 more survivors aboard. One man was missing his right arm below the elbow, a wound that had been partially controlled by the pressure of cold seawater, now bleeding freely in the relative warmth of the aircraft interior. Another had burns across his face and neck. All 5 were alive. 14 survivors total now, plus 9 crew. 23 people on an aircraft built for 8. Gordon hit the throttles. Nothing happened. Both engines were flooded. Water in the carburetors, water in the intake manifolds, water in places water had no business being. Standard procedure required 30 seconds for the engines to clear before attempting restart. A shell exploded 5 yards off the port bow, and the water column it threw up came down across the windscreen like rain. Gordon hit the starters. The left engine coughed, died, started again. Held rough and misfiring but running. The right engine refused, completely drowned. He made his decision in the time it takes to inhale. One engine, overloaded, sinking hull, 18-foot swells. He pushed the left throttle to the firewall. The single engine screamed at 3,000 revolutions per minute beyond every limit its designers had specified. The propeller, a disk of blurred metal throwing spray in all directions. The aircraft began moving. Too slowly. Gordon feathered the dead right propeller to reduce drag. At 70 miles per hour, the right engine caught on the windmilling propeller, started by nothing except airflow and desperation, and roared to life. Gordon adjusted the mixture without thinking, running on instinct accumulated across 47 missions and 1 impossible morning. Both engines now, both producing full power. At 85 miles per hour, the Catalina lifted, dropped, lifted, stalled, fell back onto the waves, and hit with an impact that knocked Davis unconscious in the bow. They bounced, hit another wave, bounced higher, and then they were airborne 20 feet, 5,100 still climbing, and a Japanese shell exploded directly beneath them, and the shockwave pushed them up another 50 feet. And for one surreal moment, the enemy artillery was helping them escape. Gordon leveled at 500 feet. Both wings had holes. The hull was held together by habit and internal structure alone. Fuel was leaking from the left wing tank at 20 gallons per minute. 14 survivors lay on the aircraft floor. Martin was bailing water with his helmet bleeding from a shrapnel cut on his forearm, refusing to stop. Then Strickler handed him a fourth message. 6 men, another B-25 crew, half a mile from the previous location. Life raft. Gordon looked at his fuel. 600 gallons and losing 20 per minute through the wing leak. 40 minutes of flight time remaining. Exactly enough to reach base. Not enough for another rescue and a return flight. Barfield put his hand on Gordon's arm. Not to stop him, just to make sure Gordon understood what the number said. Gordon looked at him. Then those 6 men do not survive at all. What happens next inside Caveang Harbor, in the next 12 minutes, will determine whether 20 men live or whether the Arkansas Traveler becomes another piece of wreckage on the bottom of a harbor that has been collecting wreckage all morning. Gordon is turning back toward the guns with 600 gallons of fuel, a disintegrating aircraft, and 14 survivors who have no idea their pilot is about to attempt a fourth landing in conditions that made the first 3 look manageable. In Part 3, the hull breaks apart on impact. The engines go underwater. Gordon has to make the one decision that even he has been avoiding all morning. And 6 men are going to find out whether the most damaged aircraft in the Pacific can still fly. 3 men pulled from the first raft. 9 from the second. 5 from the third. 14 survivors on a disintegrating aircraft. And Nathan Gordon is turning back toward Caveang Harbor with 600 gallons of fuel and a hull that is more water than metal. Part 2 ended with Gordon making the decision that Barfield said was impossible. Now the aircraft is heading back in, and this time, Arkansas Traveler is not coming home. At 11:43 a.m., Gordon touches down for the 4th time. The hull does not crack on impact. It does not groan or buckle or pop rivets. It simply separates. The aft section breaks away from the forward section with a sound like a cannon shot. Clean structural failure. The longitudinal stringer that Martin had reported fractured on the second landing, finally giving up the argument entirely. Water does not flood in. Water pours in. The cockpit is filling before Gordon has finished the landing roll. He shuts both engines down immediately, preserving what little electrical power remains, and steers on momentum alone toward the life raft 50 yards ahead. They are sinking. Visibly, measurably, rapidly sinking. Davis throws a line from the bow hatch. All 6 B-25 crew members are conscious. All 6 grab the line. All 6 pull themselves hand over hand through the swells to the aircraft. They climb through the bow hatch into a fuselage that is filling with seawater from below and has Japanese artillery falling around it from above. 20 survivors now. 29 people total on what is no longer really an aircraft. It is a sinking platform with engines attached. Gordon does not try to take off. There is nothing left to take off in. He shuts everything down, opens the overhead escape hatch, and begins organizing evacuation. They have done everything they could. 20 men are alive who would be dead or captured. That is enough. That has to be enough. Then he hears the bombers. 6 B-25 Mitchells, the ones that had already completed their strike runs on Caveang, had expended their bombs and were returning to base when their crews saw the damaged Catalina wallowing in the harbor below. These were the same men whose squad mates Gordon had spent the morning pulling out of the water. They came back. They still had ammunition. They dove toward the shore batteries and strafed every Japanese gun position in range, suppressive fire, in long sustained bursts, giving Gordon something he had not had since the P-47s went Winchester 40 minutes earlier. Cover. Gordon hit the starters on engines that were partially underwater. Standard procedure said this was not possible. The left engine turned over, sprayed water from the exhausts, coughed, and started. Rough. misfiring on cylinders that were running on a mixture of aviation fuel and harbor water. But running. The right engine followed. Both engines producing maybe 50% power combined, running on chemistry that their designers had never anticipated and would not have approved. Gordon pushed the throttles forward. The Catalina moved, not flying, not on the step, just moving, wallowing through the swells on momentum and half-power engines, the shattered hull dragging through the water rather than planing across it. 40 miles per hour. 50. Not enough to fly, maybe enough to escape. Martin and 4 survivors were bailing with helmets and bare hands, removing water, one helmet load at a time, from an aircraft that was taking it in by the ton. The B-25s kept strafing. The shore batteries went quiet, either suppressed or out of ammunition, or both. Gordon steered west toward open ocean. 1 mile. 2. 3. The guns behind him stayed silent. At 3 miles out, the right engine seized. It threw a connecting rod through the crankcase, caught fire, and Gordon shut it down and hit the extinguisher in a sequence so automatic it did not require conscious thought. The fire died. On one engine producing quarter power, the Catalina was not going to stay on the surface much longer. The forward hull section was still floating, but only because of trapped air in the bow compartment. When that air was gone, they were going under. Gordon needed something he had not needed all morning, because all morning he had been operating entirely on his own resources. He needed help. He got it. USS Reed had been on anti-submarine patrol 10 miles offshore, a Gleaves-class destroyer running at standard patrol speed, when her lookouts reported a damaged aircraft trailing smoke and barely maintaining forward motion. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Samuel Carpe, did not need a second report. He brought Reed to full speed, 35 knots, and drove her toward the struggling Catalina with the kind of urgency that men reserve for other men in the water. Reed came alongside at 12:09 p.m. Her crew launched small boats before she had fully stopped. Gordon brought the PBY down one last time, alongside the destroyer. Not a landing. Not really, more like a controlled, settling the aircraft so waterlogged it barely displaced the surface before it stopped moving. It settled like a tired animal that has finally been given permission to stop. Gently. Almost peacefully. Reed's boats pulled all 29 men from the sinking Catalina in 11 minutes. The survivors came across the water in various states of damage. Men with broken bones. Men with shrapnel wounds. Men with burns. The B-25 crewman who had lost his right arm had survived 2 hours in cold water, a life raft, and the interior of a disintegrating aircraft, and he was still conscious when Reed's corpsman got to him. Gordon was the last man off. He stood on the wing as Arkansas Traveler settled beneath the surface. Bureau number 08139. Gone. He looked at his watch. 12:17 p.m. 2 hours and 30 minutes. 4 landings. 4 takeoffs, or something close enough to takeoffs to count. 20 men saved from an active combat harbor under continuous artillery fire, with no fighter cover, a crew of 9, and an aircraft that had been structurally compromised since the second landing. The Japanese commander at Caveang filed his own report that afternoon. His shore batteries had fired an estimated 420 rounds at the rescue aircraft over the course of the morning. They had scored multiple hits. The aircraft had gone down, but 20 American airmen who should have been dead or prisoners were neither. The report noted with evident frustration that the American pilot had returned to the harbor 4 separate times, despite accumulating damage that should have made further flight operations impossible after the first landing. The Japanese had no tactical response to this, because there is no tactical response to it. You cannot write a doctrine against a man who has decided that doctrine does not apply to him. Gordon returned to VP-34 3 days later. His crew received silver stars. Gordon flew combat operations for 11 more months, completing additional missions with the Black Cat Squadron over the Bismarck Sea. He received 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 6 air medals during this period. He never discussed Caveang. Not with his crew, not with the men he had saved, not with anyone who asked. When fellow pilots in the squadron pressed him for details, he would describe the weather and the sea conditions, and then change the subject. On September 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid presented Gordon with the Medal of Honor at 7th Fleet Headquarters. The citation used the phrase "exceptional daring, personal valor, and incomparable airmanship under most perilous conditions." Gordon stood at attention during the reading of the citation and said nothing. He was 28 years old. He had been in the Pacific for 2 years. He wanted to go home. His Medal of Honor was the only one ever awarded for actions in a PBY Catalina. No other rescue pilot in the history of naval aviation attempted 4 combat landings in a single mission under direct fire in heavy seas. No other rescue pilot succeeded under those conditions. The statistical probability of what Gordon accomplished on February 15, 1944, has never been formally calculated because the people who understand the relevant mathematics have consistently concluded that the probability was not meaningfully above 0. The 20 men Gordon pulled from Caveang Harbor came from multiple B-25 crews, representing the 38th Bombardment Group and the 345th Bombardment Group, the Air Apaches, some of the most effective low-level attack units the 5th Air Force had. These were trained, experienced combat aviators. Their survival meant their experience remained available. It meant they flew additional missions. It meant some of them survived the war and went home. The second-order effects of pulling 20 men out of that harbor on that morning extend in directions that cannot be fully traced. Gordon never thought about second-order effects. He thought about fuel gauges and wave heights, and whether his engines would start. After the war, he returned to Morrilton, Arkansas, and reopened his law practice. In 1946, he ran for lieutenant governor of Arkansas, won, and served for 20 years under 4 different governors. He was effective, respected, and utterly unwilling to discuss Caveang in any political context. He did not wear his Medal of Honor in public. He did not attend Medal of Honor ceremonies unless directly asked by fellow recipients. When constituents learned about his war record and pressed him on it, he described himself as a pilot who had been in the Pacific, nothing more. He died on September 8, 2008, 4 days after his 92nd birthday. His funeral in Morrilton drew 200 people. Several of them were men he had pulled from the harbor at Caveang 64 years earlier. Old men now with grandchildren, with decades of lived life behind them, that would not have existed without 4 landings and 1 lawyer from Arkansas who did not believe that physics was the final word. Arkansas Traveler rests somewhere on the bottom of Caveang Harbor. The exact location is unknown. The water there is deep enough, and the harbor floor disturbed enough by 60 years of weather and time, that finding Bureau number 08139 would require resources and effort that no one has applied. It does not matter where the aircraft is. What matters is documented, recorded, placed permanently into the history of what human beings have been willing to do for each other. 4 landings. 20 men. One morning in February 1944, when a 27-year-old lawyer decided that the Navy's protocols were written for situations where the alternative was inconvenience, not death, and that when the alternative was death, the protocols could wait. The PBY Catalina served in every theater of the Second World War. 3,308 aircraft were built, more than any other flying boat in history. They sank submarines. They spotted fleets. They conducted reconnaissance across millions of square miles of ocean. They attacked Japanese shipping at night, low and fast, and painted black, and the Japanese called them nightmare birds and feared them in the dark. But the Catalinas are remembered most for rescue, for the Dumbo missions, for the pilots who flew slow, ugly, ungainly aircraft into places where faster and more glamorous aircraft could not go, because men were in the water and someone had to go get them. Nathan Gordon was the best of those pilots. Not because he was the most technically skilled, though he was exceptionally skilled. Not because he was the bravest, though the record speaks clearly on that question. But because, when the radio crackled with the 4th message, with 6 more men in a raft in a harbor where he had already left pieces of his aircraft on 3 separate landings, he looked at the fuel gauge and did the math and decided that the math was wrong. In Part 4, we look at what Gordon's Medal of Honor meant for the men who came after him. The doctrine that changed because of one morning. The rescue pilots who flew into impossible situations in Korea and Vietnam across 60 years of American military aviation, who did what they did because someone had shown them it was possible. And we ask the question that Gordon himself never answered: what does a man think about alone in a cockpit turning back toward the guns for the fourth time? That chapter is the one that almost nobody knows, and it may be the most important one. 4 landings. 20 men pulled from an active combat harbor under direct artillery fire, an aircraft that broke apart on the final touchdown and still managed to get airborne one last time on flooded engines and will alone. 3 parts of this story have covered what Nathan Gordon did on February 15, 1944. Part 4 covers what happened to the man afterward. And there is a detail at the end of this story that almost nobody knows, one that changes how you understand everything that came before it. Because sometimes the most important part of a hero's story is not the day he became one. Gordon returned to the United States in late 1944 after completing his full combat tour with VP-34. He had flown more than 50 missions total. He had performed 4 rescues, saving 26 men across his entire Pacific deployment. He had received the Medal of Honor, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 6 Air Medals. By any measure available to the United States Navy, Nathan Gordon was a documented American hero, the kind of man whose story should have followed him everywhere he went for the rest of his life. It did not. He went home to Morrilton, Arkansas, population 3,200, and he reopened his law practice. The same office, the same client base. Wills, property disputes, minor criminal defense. The work that had defined him before December 7, 1941, and that defined him again after September 2, 1945. His neighbors knew he had been in the Pacific. Most of them knew he had come home with medals. Very few of them knew the specific details because Gordon did not provide them. When asked directly about Caveang, he would describe the weather conditions, the sea state, the aircraft type. Then he would ask about your property dispute or your will. In 1946, he ran for lieutenant governor of Arkansas and won. He served 20 years in that office, 10 terms under 4 governors, representing both political parties. He was effective. He was respected. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely good public servant who understood Arkansas and its people with the clarity of a man who had grown up there, left briefly to see what the world was capable of, and come home with a very clear sense of what mattered. He never used Caveang as a campaign point. He never mentioned the Medal of Honor in political advertising. His opponents, who tried to use his war record against him by suggesting he was trading on heroism for votes, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of attacking a man who had never once traded on heroism for anything. The men he pulled from Caveang Harbor found him over the years, some of them. They wrote letters. They showed up in Morrilton. They brought their wives and their children and later their grandchildren. Gordon would see them, sit with them, sometimes share a meal. He was polite. He was warm. He did not discuss Caveang with them in any detail. One of the survivors, a B-25 pilot named Robert Dempsey, told a journalist decades later that visiting Gordon was like visiting a man who had done something remarkable and found the remarkableness embarrassing rather than gratifying. Gordon seemed genuinely more interested in what Dempsey had done with his life after the war than in revisiting the morning that had connected them. His Medal of Honor stayed in a drawer. But the legacy that Gordon never claimed for himself was being built without his participation across every ocean in the world. The PBY Catalina's role in combat search and rescue during the Second World War produced a doctrine that the United States military formalized and expanded across the following decades. The principle that Gordon had demonstrated at Caveang that trained pilots in the right aircraft could recover downed crews from active combat environments at acceptable risk became the philosophical foundation for dedicated combat rescue as a military specialty. Before pilots like Gordon rescue was an improvised afterthought. After them, it was a mission category, with its own aircraft, its own training programs, its own tactical manuals. In Korea, HU-16. Albatross amphibians flew rescue missions using procedures directly descended from the Dumbo protocols that VP-34 and squadrons like it had developed in the Pacific. In Vietnam, the HH-3 Jolly Green Giant helicopters of the Air Rescue Service flew into North Vietnamese territory to recover downed pilots under conditions that would have been recognizable to Gordon in their basic logic, if not their technology. The underlying principle was identical. You go in, you get the man, you accept the risk, you come home. The aircraft changed. The principle did not. Between 1941 and 1945, PBY Catalinas alone rescued an estimated 4,000 Allied personnel from downed aircraft and sinking ships across every theater of the war. The combat search and rescue mission that Gordon helped define has since saved an estimated 12,000 American military personnel across Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. 12,000 people who are alive who had children who built lives because someone decided in 1942 that slow, ugly flying boats could do something that nothing else could do. The Catalina itself was retired from American military service in 1957, but it continued flying in other capacities for decades afterward. Several operators used modified Catalinas as water bombers for forest fire suppression into the 1980s. The aircraft's ability to land on open water, its extraordinary range, and its structural toughness made it useful long after its combat role had ended. The last airworthy PBY Catalinas are maintained today by private collectors and aviation museums. There are approximately 50 of them still flying worldwide. Every one of them carries the institutional memory of what the type accomplished, including one morning in February 1944, when Bureau number 08139 made 4 landings that should not have been survivable and came up empty on the 5th only because there was nothing left of the aircraft to fly. But Gordon's real lesson was never about the aircraft. The lesson was about what happens when a system built on rational risk assessment encounters a situation where the rational assessment is wrong. The Navy's Dumbo protocols were correct for every normal situation. Don't enter defended harbors. Don't land in heavy seas. Don't overload the aircraft. These rules existed because violating them killed people. Gordon violated all of them and saved 20 people precisely because he understood something that protocol cannot encode, that the rules are written for situations where the cost of caution is inconvenience, and that when the cost of caution is 20 men drowning, the rules require renegotiation. This is not a lesson unique to 1944. Every organization, military or civilian, builds protocols based on the situations it has experienced. Those protocols become institutional knowledge, then institutional habit, then institutional law. The people inside the organization stop questioning them, not because they are unreasonable, but because questioning established procedure has social costs, and the procedure usually works. What Gordon demonstrated at Caveang is that the moment you mistake a working rule for an absolute law, you have created a category of situation where the rule will fail catastrophically. The only defense against that failure is a person who can look at the protocol and the situation simultaneously and determine which one has to give way. Gordon was that person on February 15, 1944. In any organization at any time, in any field of human endeavor, that person is the most valuable one in the room. Now, the detail that almost nobody knows. In 1989, the United States Navy conducted a review of Second World War combat rescue operations as part of a broader historical documentation project. The researchers working on this project attempted to locate surviving records related to Nathan Gordon's missions with VP-34, including the operational report filed after the Caveang rescue. They found the report. It was complete, detailed, and consistent with the accounts given by Gordon's crew members over the decades. But attached to the operational report was a second document that had never been publicly released, a damage assessment filed by the flight engineer James Martin 3 days after the mission. Martin's assessment documented something that Gordon had never mentioned and that none of the crew had discussed in any public account. On the third landing, the one at 11:14 a.m., a fragment of Japanese artillery shrapnel had penetrated the cockpit and struck Gordon in the left shoulder. The wound was not severe enough to incapacitate him, but it was significant enough that Martin's damage report listed it under crew injuries alongside the structural damage to the hull. Gordon had flown the fourth landing, the one that broke the aircraft apart, with a shrapnel wound in his shoulder. He had then organized the evacuation of 29 people, waited as the last man to leave the sinking aircraft, and climbed into Reed's rescue boat. He had not mentioned the wound to anyone until the destroyer's corpsman found it during the post-rescue medical examination. When Martin was interviewed by a historian in 1991, he was asked why Gordon had not reported the wound during the mission. Martin thought about it for a moment and then said that he had not been surprised because Gordon's approach to any problem that arose during flight was to determine whether it prevented him from completing the mission. If it did not prevent mission completion, it was recorded for post-flight maintenance and addressed afterward. The shoulder wound had not prevented mission completion. Therefore, it was a post-flight item. This is the final measure of Nathan Gordon. Not the 4 landings, not the 20 men, not the Medal of Honor in the drawer. The measure is a man with a shrapnel wound in his shoulder, sitting in the cockpit of a disintegrating aircraft in an active combat harbor, looking at the fuel gauge and doing the math, and turning back toward the guns one more time, because there were 6 more men in the water, and the math was wrong, and the wound was a post-flight item. From a small-town lawyer in Arkansas with a slow, ugly flying boat to the foundational doctrine of combat search and rescue that has saved 12,000 American lives across 80 years of military aviation. Nathan Gordon proved that the most dangerous thing in any conflict is not the enemy's weapons or the enemy's numbers. It is one person who has decided that the rules apply to every situation except this one. 4 landings, 20 men. 1 morning. 1 drawer where a Medal of Honor sat because the man who earned it believed that doing the right thing was not an achievement requiring recognition. It was simply what the situation required. That is why this story is worth telling. Not because it is exceptional, because it shows us what is possible when someone refuses to accept that impossible is a permanent category. If someone in your family served, leave their name in the comments. They deserve to be remembered too. Subscribe, because there are hundreds of stories like this one buried in operational reports and damage assessments and drawers where medals sit. We are going to find all of them.